There is a moment in every war when the sea stops being a highway and becomes a graveyard. When men who believed they were untouchable, men whose ships bore the names of rivers, of heroes, of ancient Italian glory, discovered that the darkness they had sailed into was not empty, that it was watching them, that it already knew exactly where they were. This is that moment. The Mediterranean, March of 1941. The world is already drowning in fire. France has fallen. London burns under a sky that never seems to clear. From the deserts of North Africa to the hills of Greece, the question that no one dares to speak aloud is the same everywhere. Will anyone stop this? Can anyone stop this? And out on that ancient sea, the sea the Romans once called Mare Nostrum, our sea, a fleet of Italian warships is carving westward through the night, certain they are the hunters. They have no idea they are already the hunted. What happened between the 27th and 29th of March 1941 off a rocky Greek headland called Cape Matapan is not simply a story about ships and guns. It is a story about knowledge versus ignorance, about the brilliant, silent war being fought in a country house in Buckinghamshire, England, by codebreakers who barely slept, about an admiral who staged a fake golf outing to fool a Japanese diplomat, about radar technology so secret that the Italians didn't know it existed, about how a single torpedo, dropped from a biplane that looked like it belonged in the First World War, changed the entire course of a battle, and, with it, the course of the Mediterranean campaign. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when a navy destroys another navy in under 5 minutes, when 3 battleships open fire at point-blank range, when turrets weighing dozens of tons spin into the night sky like leaves in a storm, when a cruiser that was built to last a century simply ceases to exist, then stay with us, because that is where we are going. This is the story of Cape Matapan, and it begins, as all the best stories do, with a secret. Chapter 1. The Sea Between Empires. The Mediterranean Sea is not a body of water. It is an argument that has been going on for 3,000 years. Every empire that ever called itself great, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, Spanish, British, eventually looked at that blue expanse and said the same thing: this sea must be mine. By the spring of 1941, that argument had collapsed, as arguments often do, into something far uglier than a debate. The sea had become the central artery of the entire war in the southern theatre. On one side of it lay the oil fields, the supply routes, the lifelines to North Africa and the Middle East. On the other lay everything the Axis powers needed to strangle British resistance. Whoever controlled the Mediterranean controlled the war in the south. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, that simple and that complicated. Britain's hold on the sea rested on 3 essential anchors: the fortress island of Malta, the Suez Canal at Alexandria, and the narrow passage at Gibraltar. Lose any one of them, and the entire position unravels. Malta, in particular, was already under relentless pressure. Italian aircraft had made it untenable as a frontline naval base, forcing the Royal Navy to operate at longer range, with older ships, against a younger and faster enemy fleet. The Mediterranean theatre was a contest Britain was not winning, and the men who understood the numbers knew it. Italy, for her part, had spent the 1930s building one of the most impressive blue water navies in the world. The Regia Marina, the Royal Navy of Italy, boasted swift, modern battleships, heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns, and destroyers fast enough to outrun almost anything the British could put in their path. On paper, the Italian naval position in the Mediterranean was formidable. The ships were newer, many were faster, and Italy sat at the geographic center of the sea, with ports and air bases along both the northern and African coastlines. The strategic logic seemed to point in only one direction, but war, as every commander eventually learns, is not fought on paper. The Regia Marina carried within itself a set of institutional problems that no shipbuilding program could solve. The Navy and the Air Force operated in separate worlds, governed by separate chains of command that wound through separate ministries before meeting, somewhere near the top, at the desk of Benito Mussolini himself. A naval commander at sea who needed air support had to send a request up through his own chain of command, wait for it to reach the Supreme Command, wait again for it to descend through the Air Force hierarchy, and then hope that someone at an aerodrome had the fuel, the aircraft, and the willingness to comply. By the time a response arrived, the tactical situation had almost certainly changed beyond recognition. This was not a minor administrative inconvenience. It was a structural wound at the heart of Italian naval power. Again and again throughout the war, Italian warships would sail into danger without the air cover they had been promised, because the system designed to deliver that cover was simply not built to function under the pressures of actual combat. The admirals knew this. Some of them had said so, in writing, to people who did not listen. The fuel problem was equally corrosive. Italy had no domestic oil production of any significance. Every litre of fuel oil that the Regia Marina burned had to come from somewhere else, from German allocations, from imports, from reserves that had been painstakingly gathered and were never quite enough. Every major sortie was a calculation not just of tactical risk, but of economic cost. The fleet could not afford to move without purpose, and when it did move, it could not afford to move wastefully. This constraint shaped Italian naval strategy more than any admiral's preference, more than any tactical doctrine, more than any factor, except perhaps the one Italy could do least about, the enemy they were facing. The Royal Navy had been at this for 4 centuries. Whatever advantages Italian materiel enjoyed, the British brought something that could not be manufactured in any shipyard: a culture of aggressive, independent action. British naval officers were trained to make decisions on the spot, to act on incomplete information, to push forward when caution would have pulled back. The great admirals of British history, Drake, Nelson, Jellicoe, were not remembered for hesitation, and the man now commanding the British Mediterranean Fleet carried that tradition in his bones. Admiral Sir Andrew Brown Cunningham was, by the spring of 1941, 58 years old, and had been at sea since he was 15. He was blunt, profane by the standards of the day, and almost pathologically intolerant of timidity. His ships were older than the Italian ones. Many of them had barely had time for proper maintenance. He was operating at the far end of a supply line that ran round Africa and through the Suez Canal, and yet none of that appeared to diminish him. He moved through the war with the confidence of a man who believed, at some fundamental level, that the sea owed him nothing, and that this was precisely how it should be. In the early months of 1941, as German forces began pressing into Greece, and Allied convoys shuttled troops and supplies from Alexandria to Athens, the Mediterranean reached one of its periodic pressure points. The question was no longer whether a major naval confrontation was coming. The question was, who would know about it first, and who would be ready? What would tip the balance, in the end, was not firepower, it was not speed, it was a young woman in a country house in the English countryside, staring at columns of encrypted text, who broke a code that the Italians were certain could not be broken. And with that break, the entire architecture of the coming battle shifted, silently, invisibly, completely, in Britain's favour. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Broke the Code. In a country house called Bletchley Park, set in the gentle and thoroughly unremarkable English countryside of Buckinghamshire, the most important battles of the Second World War were being fought without a single gun being fired. The men and women who worked there, mathematicians, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, chess champions, classicists, and an extraordinary number of people who simply thought differently from everyone else, carried the weight of secrets that they could not discuss with their families, their friends, or even most of their colleagues. They worked in wooden huts that were cold in winter and stifling in summer. They worked in shifts. They worked on problems that sometimes had no solution for weeks, and then suddenly collapsed in a moment of clarity that felt almost like a physical thing. In late March of 1941, one of those moments arrived. The cryptanalyst's name was Mavis Beatty. She was 21 years old. She worked in a section of Bletchley overseen by the brilliant and eccentric Dilly Knox, a classical scholar who had been breaking codes since the First World War and who led his team with an intensity that alternated between inspiration and chaos. Beatty and her colleagues had been wrestling with the Italian naval variant of the Enigma cipher machine for months. The Italian Navy used a version of Enigma that was subtly different from the German military variants, and the methods that worked on one did not automatically transfer to the other. The breakthrough, when it came, began with a fragment. The first message Beatty decrypted from the Italian naval Enigma was cryptic almost to the point of comedy. Today's the day -3. It told her almost nothing on its own, but it told her something critical. The key was broken. The cipher was open. 3 days later, a second message came through, and this one was not cryptic at all. It described the sailing of a substantial Italian fleet: 1 battleship, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, destroyers, their heading, their purpose, the British convoys they intended to intercept. For the first time in the war, the Royal Navy was going to know, in advance, exactly what the Regia Marina was planning to do. The challenge now was not intelligence, it was deception. The golden rule of signals intelligence in the Second World War was absolute. You could only use what you knew if you could conceal the fact that you knew it. The moment the Italians suspected their codes were compromised, they would change them, the window would close, and everything would go dark again. Every use of ultra-intelligence, the code word given to material derived from Enigma decryptions, had to be accompanied by a plausible cover story. In this case, the cover was a carefully directed British reconnaissance aircraft, visibly flying over the Italian fleet's area of operation, giving the Italians a reason to believe they had been spotted by eyes rather than by mathematics. Admiral Cunningham received the intelligence and absorbed it with the calm of a man who had spent decades playing naval chess. His response was methodical and, in its way, theatrical. He needed to leave Alexandria with his battleships without alerting Italian agents in the port, who would immediately signal Rome. His solution was the kind of thing that belongs in a spy novel rather than a historical record, except that every detail is documented. He arrived at a golf club in Alexandria that afternoon, visibly, with his suitcase, apparently settling in for an overnight stay. He made a point of being seen on the golf course by the Japanese consul. An evening party was advertised aboard his flagship. Then, after dark, Cunningham slipped away, boarded the battleship HMS Warspite, and put to sea without a light. The Italian side of the intelligence picture was almost a mirror image, except running entirely in the wrong direction. The Germans had provided their Italian allies with an assessment of British strength in the Mediterranean that was wrong in nearly every particular. According to German intelligence, the British had only 1 operational battleship at Alexandria. In fact, there were 3. More critically, the Germans reported that the British aircraft carrier Illustrious had been badly damaged, which was true, but failed to mention that she had been replaced by HMS Formidable, which was fully operational and loaded with torpedo aircraft. Admiral Iachino, commanding the Italian fleet from the bridge of the new battleship Vittorio Veneto, was sailing into waters he believed he largely controlled, based on information that was comprehensively, fatally inaccurate. The Italians had something else working against them that went beyond mere intelligence failures. Guglielmo Marconi, the great Italian inventor who had pioneered radio transmission and who had been actively working on shipboard radio location technology in the early 1930s, had died in 1937. Without his driving energy, that work had not been followed through. The Italians had no radar. They did not know the British had it. They had no way of seeing in the dark except with their eyes. And the night of the 28th of March 1941 was going to be very dark indeed. On the evening of the 26th of March, an Italian spotter plane flew over Alexandria harbour and observed what it came to see: the British battleships Warspite, Barham and Valiant, and the carrier Formidable, sitting quietly at anchor. The report went back to the Italian Naval Command at Rome, known as Super Marina, and from there to Admiral Iachino aboard Vittorio Veneto. The main British fleet was in port. The sea ahead was clear. On the 26th of March, the Italian armada departed from its various home ports, Naples, Taranto, Brindisi, Messina, to converge at sea. By the time that Italian reconnaissance planes' report reached Iachino, the ships it had described as sitting safely in harbour were already gone. Mavis Beatty, decades later, recalled the atmosphere at Bletchley Park when they learned what their work had set in motion. There are moments, she said, that live in the memory not as facts but as feelings, the specific quality of a morning when you understand that something you did in a cold hut, staring at meaningless letters, has altered the shape of something real. For the codebreakers of Dilly Knox's section, Cape Matapan would be that morning. Chapter 3. The Fleet That Went to Sea. On the morning of the 27th of March 1941, the Italian fleet was at sea in force. From the bridge of the Vittorio Veneto, Admiral Angelo Iachino commanded one of the most powerful naval assemblages the Regia Marina had put to sea since the war began. The Vittorio Veneto herself was a modern, fast battleship, a vessel of 45,000 tons, capable of 30 knots, armed with 9 15-inch guns, and carrying the latest in Italian naval construction and design. Around her steamed 3 squadrons of heavy cruisers, the Bolzano, Trieste, and Trento under Admiral Sansonetti, the Zara, Fiume, and Pola under Admiral Cattaneo, and, joining from Brindisi, 2 light cruisers of the 8th Division. 13 destroyers completed the armada. On paper, it was a formidable force. Iachino was not, by temperament, a gambler. He was a careful officer, methodical in his thinking, cautious about risk. He had accepted this operation, known as Operation Gaudo, not because he was confident of success, but because the pressure from Berlin had made refusal politically impossible. The Germans needed the British supply lines to Greece interrupted. The Italian surface fleet was the only tool available for the job. Fuel oil had been allocated, a significant concession from a German logistics system that was itself stretched thin. And so Iachino had sailed, carrying with him a professional unease that his flagship's new paint and his German-provided intelligence could not quite suppress. The plan was straightforward in conception, as plans often are. The Italian fleet would sweep the waters south of Crete, intercept the British convoys running between Alexandria and Athens, and deal a blow to the Allied supply effort significant enough to affect the unfolding campaign in Greece. Speed was the critical variable. The Vittorio Veneto could make 30 knots, and the Italian cruisers were faster still. The British heavy units, if they were indeed confined to harbour, could not interfere. The operation was designed to be over before the Royal Navy could respond. What Iachino did not know, could not know, was that the British were already moving. Cunningham's battle squadron had left Alexandria during the night of the 26th, moving through the darkness with their radar eyes open and their purpose concealed. South of Crete, Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple was at sea with a force of 4 light cruisers, HMS Ajax, HMS Gloucester, HMS Orion, and the Australian light cruiser Hamas Perth, along with 3 destroyers. These were Force B, and their orders placed them in a specific position southwest of the island of Gavdos by dawn on the 28th. Cunningham and his battleships were converging from the east. The 2 halves of the British trap were closing, slowly, carefully, invisibly, around a fleet that was still congratulating itself on the element of surprise. On the morning of the 27th, an Italian spotter plane was launched from Vittorio Veneto's deck. These small reconnaissance floatplanes were the Regia Marina's eyes beyond visual range, single-use scouts that would have to fly onto land rather than return to the battleship, as the Vittorio Veneto lacked the recovery equipment that British carriers had as a matter of course. The plane found the waters south of Crete largely empty, no convoys, no obvious British warships. The report went back to Iachino as confirmation of his intelligence. The sea was his. The following morning, the 28th, a British Sunderland flying boat spotted the Italian fleet at noon. The Italians were now visible to the British. But, crucially, the Italian reconnaissance had also, by midday of the 28th, determined that HMS Formidable was at sea. Iachino's intelligence picture was beginning to fracture. The carrier's presence meant the danger he had been told did not exist was, in fact, real. There were discussions at Supermarina in Rome. The decision, made after deliberation that has since been described by Italian naval historians as one of the war's great command failures, was to continue the operation. The reasoning was partly institutional pride. The Germans needed reassurance that their Italian allies had the will to fight, and partly a reliance on the speed advantage that the Vittorio Veneto and her consorts theoretically enjoyed. They would press ahead. If danger came, they would simply outrun it. That morning, on the bridge of HMS Orion, a junior officer looked up and saw a large warship where he had not expected one. He turned to a colleague and said, in the conversational way that people sometimes frame the most consequential observations, "What's that battleship over there? I thought ours were miles away. It was not one of theirs." The Italians, monitoring British radio traffic, intercepted the signal that followed as Orion reported an unknown vessel and went to investigate. Admiral Iachino, aboard Vittorio Veneto, heard of this and understood its implication. At 10:55 on the morning of the 28th, the Italian battleship opened fire on Pridham Whipple's cruiser squadron at a range of 25,000 yards. The British cruisers were outgunned. Vittorio Veneto fired 94 rounds in 29 salvos. The shells fell with frightening accuracy, close enough that fragments of the 15-inch rounds caused slight damage to the British ships. Pridham Whipple ordered his ships to lay smoke and run. It was not a retreat born of fear. It was a deliberate tactical maneuver, pulling the Italian fleet toward the waiting British battleships to the east. The trap's second jaw was now ready to close. All Cunningham needed was for the Italians to keep coming, but Iachino stopped. His professional caution, the same caution that had made him uneasy about the operation from the start, now worked in his favor and against the British plan. Something about the speed and the angle of the British retreat felt wrong to him. He smelled a trap. He ordered the Italian fleet to turn northwest and withdraw toward home. At noon, the Italians broke off engagement and headed for Taranto. The first phase of the battle, the chase, the pursuit, the elegant British maneuver toward an engagement Cunningham had planned and prepared, had ended in a near miss. The Regia Marina was running home, and so the battle moved into its second phase. If the sea would not deliver the Italian fleet into a gun duel on British terms, then Cunningham had another weapon. He had Formidable. He had her torpedo aircraft. He had the afternoon sky and 3 squadrons of biplanes that looked laughably obsolete and had already, just 4 months earlier, crippled the Italian battle fleet at its moorings in Taranto harbor. If the fleet wouldn't come to the battleships would send something ahead to slow the fleet down. Chapter 4. The Biplane and the Battleship. There is something almost deliberately absurd about the Fairey Albacore torpedo bomber. It was a biplane, 2 wings, struts, fabric covering, of the kind that any visitor to a 1918 airshow would have recognized instantly. It flew at speeds that a determined motorcar might have challenged. It carried a single torpedo slung beneath its belly like an afterthought. In 1941, it was already approaching obsolescence by almost every metric that aviation engineers used to measure such things. And yet, on the afternoon of the 28th of March 1941, these ungainly aircraft changed the course of a battle that no amount of gunnery or speed could otherwise have resolved. HMS Formidable had launched her first wave of albacores earlier that morning in an attack that accomplished something more important than it appeared to at the time. The aircraft had not scored hits, but their presence, the sight of torpedo planes attacking from low altitude, forcing the Vittorio Veneto into sharp evasive maneuvers, had disrupted the Italian pursuit of Pridham Whipple's cruisers and bought those ships the time they needed to escape. The torpedo aircraft had functioned, in that first strike, less as weapons than as shields. The second strike, launched in the early afternoon, was a different matter. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 Albacore aircraft had found the Vittorio Veneto and were closing. The Italians, occupied with defending against a formation of Bristol Blenheim bombers attacking from high altitude, had their guns and their attention directed upward. The Albacores came in low, out of the afternoon sun, the oldest and most reliable tactical approach in combat aviation, made new again by the simple geometry of angles. The pilot of the lead aircraft was Lieutenant Commander John Dalyell Stead. He had won the Distinguished Service Order already in this war. He flew his Albacore to within 1,000 meters of the Vittorio Veneto, a range at which the Italian gunners could barely miss, and released his torpedo. The hit was precise. The torpedo struck the Italian battleship in her outer port propeller, below the waterline, and the flooding was catastrophic in its immediate impact. 4,000 long tons of water began entering the ship. She lost power. She stopped. For a moment, and moments in naval warfare can be everything, the most powerful ship in the Italian fleet sat dead in the water, unable to move, unable to fight effectively, enormous and suddenly helpless. Dalyell Stead's aircraft was shot down by Vittorio Veneto's anti-aircraft guns almost immediately after the torpedo left the plane. He and his 2 crew members died. They would be the only British aircraft casualties of the entire battle. The damage control teams aboard Vittorio Veneto worked with controlled urgency through the following hours. By 42 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, they had done enough. The battleship was moving again, making 19 knots, well below her design speed of 30, but moving. Iachino set course for Taranto. He pushed his damaged flagship and her escorts at the best speed they could manage, and he had reason to believe that 19 knots was fast enough. The British battleships were still more than 60 miles behind him. Even a wounded Vittorio Veneto could outrun them. What Iachino was calculating, with some justification, was the mathematics of pursuit. He had time, he had distance, and he had the approaching darkness, which in the age before radar would have wrapped his fleet in a cloak of near-perfect invisibility. What he had not calculated, what he could not have calculated because he did not know the technology existed, was that British ships were equipped with radar that could see through darkness as readily as through daylight. The darkness he was running toward was not a refuge, it was a hunting ground. At 7:30 in the evening, the third and final aerial attack of the day was launched from Formidable. 6 albacores and 2 fairy swordfish pressed toward the withdrawing Italian fleet. Iachino had deployed his ships in a defensive formation around Vittorio Veneto, 3 columns, with searchlights scanning the sky and a heavy anti-aircraft barrage filling the air above and around the battleship. The formation worked. No further torpedo hit the Vittorio Veneto, but one torpedo found another target. The heavy cruiser Pola, one of 3 sister ships of the Zara class, 8-inch gunned, 11,000 tons, a vessel that could in almost any other circumstance defend herself with considerable effect, was struck on her port side, aft. The torpedo, apparently released by Lieutenant Granger Williams, hit with surgical bad luck. It flooded 5 of Pola's boiler rooms simultaneously and destroyed the main steam line. Every ounce of electrical power in the ship died. Her engines went silent, her weapons went dark. In the gathering dusk of a Mediterranean evening, surrounded by the rest of the Italian fleet that was moving away from her, the Pola drifted to a stop. The other Italian ships, steaming at speed in the confused darkness, did not immediately realize what had happened. By the time Iachino learned of the Pola's condition, the rest of the fleet had already put considerable distance between themselves and the drifting cruiser. He faced a command decision that would later become one of the most debated questions of the entire Mediterranean War: what to do about a stopped ship when an enemy force of unknown composition is somewhere behind you and closing. He chose to send help. He ordered the rest of the Zara division, the heavy cruisers Zara and Fiume, accompanied by 4 destroyers, to turn back and recover the stricken Pola. It was the decision that sealed the night. Chapter 5. Darkness. As a weapon. Night fell on the Mediterranean with the particular finality of southern latitudes. Not a gradual dimming, but a door closing on the light. By 20 minutes past 8 on the evening of the 28th of March, the sea was dark. The stars had not yet fully established themselves overhead, and in the spaces between the Italian and British fleets, the water was as unreadable as black glass. Iachino believed this darkness protected him. He was guiding his damaged flagship toward Taranto at 19 knots, with an escort screening his retreat, and he was doing the calculation in his head that any commander would do: distance, speed, time. He needed roughly 8 hours to reach safety. He believed he had them. Aboard HMS Orion, at 20 minutes past 8 in the evening, a radar operator was working his screen with the focused attention that the technology demanded. The screen was green-tinged in the dim light of the operations room. The operator was looking for Italian ships, and then, 6 miles to port, a contact appeared. It was stationary. It was large. It was the Pola, stopped and drifting, her crew in the strange, helpless position of men aboard a powerless ship in a darkened sea who can hear aircraft and distant gunfire, but can do nothing about any of it. The radar had found her before any eye could. The contact was reported up the chain of command. Cunningham had a choice. He could send destroyers to deal with the Pola and hold his battleships back. The cautious option, the option that accepted that a damaged cruiser was a satisfactory prize, and that risking the battle fleet to night action was unnecessary. Several of his senior officers argued for exactly this. The waters ahead were uncertain. German and Italian aircraft would have the fleet at dawn. The risks of a night engagement with an enemy of unknown composition were real, but Cunningham was not a cautious man. His comment, recorded by those present, was characteristically direct. The enemy was ahead, impeded. His battleships had fuel, ammunition, and a position advantage they had spent 3 days maneuvering to achieve. He pressed forward. What happened next unfolded, from the Italian perspective, as the worst kind of nightmare. the kind where you understand what is happening, but cannot move fast enough to stop it. The Zara and Fiume, along with their 4 accompanying destroyers, had turned back to assist the Polar. They were steaming at 16 knots, a fuel conservation measure, because Iachino still did not know a British battle fleet was within striking distance. His orders to the Zara division had been given in the reasonable expectation that the recovery operation could be completed and the ships back in the shelter of Italian-controlled waters before dawn. The destroyers steaming behind the cruisers had their main gun batteries in their resting positions, not loaded for action. The Italian naval doctrine, shaped by years of practice and theoretical emphasis on daytime fleet engagements, had given little sustained attention to the specific demands of fighting at night. They had no radar. This was not an oversight. It was the consequence of a history, the death of Marconi in 1937, the failure to follow through on his work, the institutional assumption that the primary theatre of naval combat was the daylight sea rather than the darkness. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. The Zara division was steaming through the dark, toward a stopped cruiser that was radiating heat and debris, toward an enemy they could not see, with no technology to compensate for what their eyes could not do. At a few minutes before 10 o'clock at night, lookouts on the Italian ships spotted something in the darkness. Shapes, large shapes, moving on a parallel course, very close. The initial thought, confirmed by the darkness and the unfamiliarity of night contact, was that these were Italian ships, perhaps the Vittorio Veneto's own escort, which had been positioned somewhere in the area. The thought lasted seconds. Aboard the British destroyer HMS Greyhound, the searchlights came on. The beams cut across the black water and fell full on the Italian cruiser Fiume, illuminating her in a light so sudden and complete that the men aboard her would later describe the experience as something outside the ordinary categories of shock. Among those manning searchlights on this night, aboard HMS Valiant, was a young officer who had joined the Mediterranean fleet only recently, Midshipman Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. He was 19 years old. His searchlight beams joined the others, painting the Italian warships white in the darkness. All 3 British battleships, Warspite, Barham and Valiant, opened fire simultaneously at a range of 3,800 yards. This is point-blank range for 15-inch naval guns. For context, battleship gunnery in this war was normally conducted at distances of 15, 20, or even 25,000 yards, where the mathematics of trajectory and timing allowed for misses. At 3,800 yards, there was no trajectory to manage. The guns aimed, the guns fired, and the shells arrived. Fiume was struck in the first salvo, then struck again, and again. Gunners aboard the British ships watched, with something that was perhaps less satisfaction than sheer awe, as main turrets, structures weighing many tons, were lifted from the Italian cruiser's deck and flung into the sky. Zara was also taken under fire within the first minute. Both Italian cruisers fought back as best they could, under conditions that precluded effective resistance. In under 5 minutes, they were burning wrecks. 2 of the 4 Italian destroyers, Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci, were also destroyed in the initial action. The other 2, Vincenzo Gioberti and Alfredo Oriani, managed to escape under cover of smoke, both of them damaged, both of them running hard into the darkness. The entire engagement from searchlight to ceasefire had lasted approximately 5 minutes. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were destroyed or fatally damaged. The men aboard the Italian ships had no warning, no time to respond effectively, and no technology that might have warned them of what was approaching. It was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of what radar, combined with aggression, training, and 3 battleships at point-blank range, could accomplish against an enemy who was fighting in the dark as if it were still the 19th century. The British battleships turned away to avoid the confusion of the subsequent destroyer action. Cunningham ordered his destroyers forward. In the melee that followed, in the darkness and the smoke and the wreckage of 2 destroyed cruisers, the destroyer Giosuè Carducci was sunk. The burning hulk of Zara drifted through the night, still alive but dying. Chapter 6. The Survivors and the Reckoning Dawn, on the 29th of March 1941, came over a sea that had been transformed overnight into something that looked less like a theatre of naval operations and more like an aftermath. Wreckage, oil, debris that had, hours before, been the fighting fabric of the Regia Marina, and among the wreckage, in the water that was cold by Mediterranean standards at this time of year, the survivors. In the hours after the main action ended, the British fleet moved through the area where the Italian cruisers had been destroyed. Destroyers lowered lines. Men were pulled from the water. The destroyer HMS Jervis came alongside the stricken Zara, which was still afloat but clearly could not be saved. Jervis fired 2 torpedoes into the burning hull, and at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning of the 29th, Zara went down. The Polar, the cruiser whose stopping had triggered the whole catastrophic sequence, was still floating when the destroyer HMS Havoc found her. What happened aboard the Polar was one of those scenes that history tends to suppress in favor of cleaner narratives. The crew of the powerless cruiser had been unable to fight, unable to flee, and unable to communicate their situation to the rest of the fleet for hours. Some had gone into the water, some had come back. They were cold, they were wet, and some of them had found wine from the ship's stores to try to ward off the chill. When a British boarding party came aboard, they found approximately 200 men still on the cruiser, shivering, wrapped in whatever they could find, some of them drinking to stay warm. The British sailors noted the wine. It would later become the basis of a rumour, repeated in some Allied accounts, that the Italian crew had been drunk when they were found. The truth was considerably more prosaic. They were wet and cold, and there was nothing else to drink. The question of whether to tow the Polar back to Alexandria as a prize was considered briefly and abandoned practically. Daylight was coming. German and Italian aircraft could be expected with the morning. A powerless cruiser at the end of a tow rope would be a liability rather than an asset. The boarding party stripped what they could. A number of Italian Breda anti-aircraft machine guns that the Royal Navy had immediate use for were taken off, and the Polar's surviving crew was brought aboard the British ships. Then torpedoes from Jervis and HMS Nubian sent the last of the 3 Zara-class heavy cruisers to the bottom shortly after 4 in the morning. The rescue operation that followed became, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable episodes of the naval war. British destroyers began pulling Italian survivors from the water as daylight grew. The numbers of men in the sea were larger than any rescue operation could efficiently manage. The losses of Zara and Fiume together had put more than 2,000 men into the water, and not all of them had survived the night. British destroyers were pulling men from the sea throughout the morning, and by 8 o'clock they had recovered roughly 915 Italian sailors. Then German dive bombers arrived, and the rescue had to end. The British ships had to move. But Cunningham did not simply leave the men still in the water to their fate. He composed a signal on the Merchant Marine emergency band, an open, unencrypted broadcast that the Italian Naval Command in Rome could receive. He informed them of the location of the remaining survivors. He stated that air attack had forced his ships to withdraw and that their rescue was no longer possible. He offered safe passage to an Italian hospital ship. The message was received. The hospital ship Gradisca was dispatched. By that evening, several hundred more Italian sailors had been recovered from the sea. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in one of the war's stranger ironies, reprimanded Cunningham for broadcasting the signal. The concern was operational security, that openly communicating Italian losses and locations might compromise ongoing operations. Cunningham, by most accounts, was not particularly troubled by the rebuke. He had done what he believed a naval officer should do. The final accounting of the battle, as it was assembled in the days that followed, told a stark story. Italy had lost 3 heavy cruisers, the Zara, Fiume, and Pola, the entire 1st Cruiser Division, and 2 destroyers. Up to 2,300 Italian sailors were dead, missing, or captured. The Vittorio Veneto had limped into Taranto damaged, requiring months of repairs. The British had lost 3 airmen, the crew of Daliel Stead's torpedo aircraft, and no ships of any kind. It was, by the measures that naval historians use, one of the most one-sided fleet engagements of the entire war. Admiral Iachino, in the difficult weeks and months after the battle, wrote with characteristic directness about what had gone wrong. He did not blame his crews. He did not, in the accounts that survive, make excuses for failures of execution. His analysis cut deeper, identifying 2 structural problems that no amount of tactical skill could have overcome: the absence of effective coordination between the fleet at sea and the air forces on land, and what he called the backwardness of Italian night fighting technology relative to the British. Both observations were accurate. Both pointed to problems that the Italian High Command had been warned about repeatedly and had not resolved. For the Royal Navy, the victory had an emotional weight that the statistics alone could not fully capture. The Mediterranean fleet had been fighting, largely alone, against Italian and increasingly German forces for nearly a year. It had suffered losses, ships, men, sustained operational pressure, that had tested the institution's resilience in ways that were not always visible from London. Cape Matapan was, in a way that Taranto had been too sudden and too one-sided to fully provide, a demonstration that the Mediterranean was not lost, that the Regia Marina could be beaten in a straight fight, and that the ships and men of the fleet under Cunningham were capable of aggressive, complex, multi-day operations that ended not in retreat, but in victory. At Bletchley Park, a few weeks after the battle, Admiral Cunningham arrived in person. The codebreakers, the young women and the eccentric scholars and the crossword champions in their cold wooden huts, had been told almost nothing about the effects of their work, as the rules of operational security demanded. Cunningham walked through and said what needed to be said, that they had won a great victory, and that it was their work, more than any gun or aircraft, that had made it possible. The Director of Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey, sent a message to Dilly Knox that distilled everything to its essential truth. Tell Dilly that we have won a great victory in the Mediterranean, and it is entirely due to his girls. Mavis Beatty, the 21-year-old cryptanalyst who had broken the Italian enigma, remembered the moment for the rest of her life. Their sense of elation, she said, knew no bounds. The Italian fleet did not venture into the eastern Mediterranean again for 2 months. The eastern sea lanes, the supply routes between Alexandria and Athens, that had been Operation Gaudo's target, remained open. The convoys continued to run. The troops, the supplies, the fuel, the ammunition that the Allied position in Greece and later in Crete depended on continued to move. The Regia Marina, from this point forward, would be a fleet defined less by what it did than by what it declined to do. The War at Sea, Chapter 7. The Ghost Fleet, Italy's Naval Doctrine and its Contradictions. There is a particular kind of institutional tragedy that does not arrive in a single moment. It accumulates slowly, over years of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, each defensible in isolation, until one day, the weight of all those decisions comes down at once. The Regia Marina that sailed into the waters south of Crete in March of 1941 was not a fleet that had failed through negligence or cowardice. It was a fleet that had been shaped, over a decade and a half, by a doctrine built around assumptions that the war would methodically dismantle, one by one, until nothing remained but the wreckage floating off Cape Matapan. The roots of Italian naval doctrine ran back to the aftermath of the First World War, when Italian strategic planners had made a series of choices that, in their time, seemed logical. Italy had emerged from that war as a nominal victor, but a disappointed one. The Versailles settlement had denied her the territorial gains her politicians and generals had promised the Italian public. The Navy, watching the peace conferences and their outcomes, drew from this experience a specific operational philosophy, that Italy's primary naval adversaries would be France and Britain, that the Mediterranean was the central theatre, and that the most effective Italian strategy was to preserve the battle fleet as a fleet in being, a force so significant that the enemy could not ignore it, whether or not it ever fired a shot in anger. A fleet in being strategy has a seductive logic to it. The fleet exists. The enemy must maintain forces to counter it. The mere presence of the fleet shapes the enemy's decisions, constrains their movements, forces them to keep ships in waters they would prefer to use elsewhere. In theory, a navy following this strategy can win the war without fighting a major engagement. In practice, it creates an institution that trains for a battle it never intends to fight, that builds ships optimized for a contest it will perpetually defer, and that develops a culture of protective caution rather than aggressive initiative. By 1941, the Regia Marina had been marinating in this culture for 15 years. The specific consequences showed up in predictable places. Italian naval gunnery, practiced at long range in calm daylight conditions against towed targets, was genuinely excellent on those terms. The torpedo officers and gun crews were well trained in the technical skills of their positions, But the exercises that revealed these skills took place in conditions that combat would never provide. No enemy fire, no evasive maneuvering, no darkness, no mechanical failures cascading through a ship simultaneously. The gap between practiced performance and combat performance was wide, and no one in the Naval Command had made a serious institutional effort to close it. Night fighting was the clearest example of this gap. The Regia Marina had written doctrine for night engagements. It had procedures, signals codes, formation guides. What it had not done was train for night fighting in the way that combat demands, with the chaos and confusion and the near impossibility of identifying friend from enemy in darkness, with the searchlights and the gun flashes that destroy night vision and replace tactical clarity with a world of sudden light and deep shadow. The British had trained for night engagements repeatedly and seriously. Their destroyer captains knew how to use darkness as a weapon. Their gunnery officers knew how to range by radar return rather than by optical rangefinder. These were not small technical differences. They were the difference between a battle and a catastrophe. The fuel constraint that shaped every Italian operational decision deserves its own chapter in any honest history of the Mediterranean War. The Italian strategic position was, in the most fundamental material sense, dependent on external supply. Germany controlled the oil. Germany decided how much Italian warships could burn, and Germany's decisions were shaped by German priorities, German logistics, and a German understanding of what the Italian fleet was for, which was, primarily, to be available to threaten British operations without necessarily engaging in them. This German view of Italian naval strategy was, paradoxically, even more conservative than the Italians' own. The result was a fleet that was frequently unable to put to sea when opportunity arose, and that, when it did sail, did so with a consciousness of every litre of fuel that made aggressive tactical decision-making deeply psychologically difficult. There was also the question of the Air Force. The divorce between the Regia Marina and the Regia Aeronautica, the Royal Air Force of Italy, was not merely an administrative problem. It was a reflection of deep institutional jealousies and competing ambitions that went back to the 1920s, when Mussolini had elevated the Air Force as the prestige service of his new Italy. The Air Force had been given control of all military aviation, which meant that the Navy had no carrier aviation and no organic air power of its own. Requests for air support had to go through channels that assumed peacetime timescales. The result, at sea, was that Italian warships sailed into areas where they needed air cover and received none, or received it hours after the moment when it could have been effective. Admiral Iachino had understood these problems before he sailed. His after-action analysis, written in the months following Matapan, did not disguise his frustration. The promised fighter cover that was to have protected the fleet's western approaches during Operation Gaudo had not materialized. The reconnaissance that was to have confirmed British dispositions was based on a single flyover that missed the fact that 3 British battleships had left harbour during the night. The communications between his flagship and the Air Force's headquarters in Rome had been slow, formal, and ultimately useless in the fast-moving tactical situation that developed. He had been sent to sea with a plan built on assumptions, and when those assumptions proved false, there was no system in place to give him the information he needed to adapt. The broader tragedy, which Iachino's analysis only touches on obliquely, is that the men who paid the price for these institutional failures were not the admirals and the generals and the bureaucrats who had created them. They were the sailors aboard the Zara and the Fiume and the Pola, men who had done everything their training demanded, who had maintained their ships, who had sailed when ordered, who had served their navy with whatever it provided them. When the British searchlights came on at 10 o'clock on the night of the 28th, the men standing on the decks of those cruisers had no more ability to change the outcome of what was about to happen than they had the ability to make radar appear on their ships by force of will. They had been failed long before that night, by decisions made in offices far from the sea. What Cape Matapan ultimately exposed was not the courage or the competence of the Regia Marina's sailors. It exposed the cost of building a fleet for a war you intend to avoid. A navy organized around the philosophy of the fleet in being inevitably atrophies in the skills that actual combat demands. When Iachino's fleet finally met Cunningham's in the darkness off Cape Matapan, the difference in capability was not primarily about ships or guns. It was about 2 navies, one of which had spent its recent history preparing to fight, and one of which had spent its recent history preparing to threaten. In the dark Mediterranean night, that difference was measured in lives. Chapter 8. Cunningham, the admiral who played golf. Andrew Brown Cunningham was not, by any conventional measure, a comfortable man to be around. He was demanding, in the way that only people who demand the most from themselves can be demanding of others, not unreasonably, not capriciously, but with a consistent intensity that left little room for excuses and no room at all for self-pity. He had been at sea since he was 15 years old. He had served in the Boer War, in the Gallipoli campaign, in the destroyer actions of the First World War, and through 20 years of peace in various commands that had kept him moving and working when less driven men might have found comfortable posts and comfortable habits. By the time the Mediterranean fleet fell to him in 1939, he was one of the most experienced naval officers alive, and he wore that experience not as ornament, but as operating equipment. He had also, somewhere along the way, developed a specific philosophy about information and its relationship to action. Many commanders, when faced with incomplete intelligence, defaulted to caution, waiting for clarity before committing. Cunningham's instinct ran the other way. He believed that the cost of waiting for certainty was almost always greater than the cost of acting on probability. This was not recklessness. It was a calibrated aggression built on genuine knowledge of his own forces and a realistic assessment of what the enemy could and could not do. When ultra-intelligence told him that an Italian fleet was at sea and moving, he did not ask for confirmation. He moved. The golf course episode, which has become perhaps the most celebrated anecdote of the entire Matapan story, was not an improvisation. It was a carefully constructed piece of counterintelligence theatre, designed to address a specific problem that Cunningham had identified before the operation began. Alexandria Harbour in the spring of 1941 was not a secure environment. Italian intelligence agents were active in the city. The Japanese consul, Japan was not yet at war, but her diplomatic sympathies were well understood, had clear lines of communication back to Axis intelligence networks. If Cunningham's battleships were seen leaving harbour, the information would reach Rome, and D'Aquino would know that the Mediterranean fleet was at sea. The entire trap would collapse. So Cunningham played golf. He arrived at the club visibly, with overnight luggage, in the early afternoon of the 26th. He was seen at the course. He was noted at the party he allowed to be advertised aboard his flagship. The Alexandria social scene, which was surprisingly active for a city supporting a fleet at war, buzzed with the admiral's apparent availability. And then, after dark, Cunningham went quietly back to the harbour, boarded HMS Warspite, and put to sea. By the time anyone noticed, his battle fleet was gone, invisible, blacked out, moving east toward its rendezvous with Pridham Whipple's cruisers. The last Italian intelligence report on the British battleships placed them in harbour. It was accurate at the time it was filed. By the time it reached Rome, it was useless. This kind of thinking, the deliberate shaping of what the enemy sees, the recognition that intelligence is a weapon that can cut both ways, was characteristic of how Cunningham approached the entire Mediterranean campaign. He was not above employing deception. He was not above using the enemy's own confidence against them. The Italian fleet had sailed toward the eastern Mediterranean, partly because its intelligence told it the British were confined to harbour. That intelligence was the product not just of Italian reconnaissance failures, but of a specifically designed British deception. Cunningham had not just laid a gun trap, he had laid an information trap first, and the gun trap was only made possible because the information trap had worked. His relationship with the intelligence coming from Bletchley Park was one of the more delicate operational challenges of his command. The ultra material was, without question, transformative. It told him things that he could not otherwise have known: ship movements, sailing orders, operational intentions, with a precision that made conventional intelligence look impressionistic. But the rules governing its use were strict and uncompromising. Every use had to be covered. Every reaction to ultra-intelligence had to be explainable without reference to signals intelligence. This meant that Cunningham was frequently in the position of knowing more than he could act on directly and having to engineer situations, the visible reconnaissance aircraft, the carefully staged patrol, that gave his knowledge a plausible source. This constraint did something interesting to Cunningham's planning. Because he could not simply act on intelligence directly, every plan had to be architecturally robust, capable of working even if the cover story was questioned, capable of being explained after the fact as the product of sound conventional tactics rather than secret information. The result was that Matapan worked on two levels simultaneously. It was an operation shaped by ultra-intelligence, and it was also a sound conventional naval operation that would have been worth attempting even without that intelligence. Cunningham did not build plans that only worked if the intelligence was correct. He built plans that intelligence made excellent and that conventional good sense made viable. After the battle, when the scale of the victory became clear, Cunningham's response was notably measured. He was pleased. He was not triumphant in the way that some commanders would have been. He wrote in his report that the escape of the Vittorio Veneto was much to be regretted, a phrase that tells you everything about the man's standards. He had sunk 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers, had rescued nearly 1,000 Italian sailors, had sent a signal of such moral force through the Mediterranean that the Italian fleet would not venture into the Eastern Sea again for 2 months, and his primary editorial comment was that the flagship had got away. He also, in the days following the battle, made the decision to visit Bletchley Park in person. This was not required. It was not expected. It was, in the institutional culture of wartime intelligence work, almost unprecedented. The codebreakers were accustomed to silence, to never being told what happened to the material they produced, to working in an informational void where their contribution was acknowledged only in the abstract. Cunningham walked into that void and made it concrete. His visit, and what he said to the men and women of Hut 8 and Dilly Knox's section, was remembered by those present as one of the more significant moments of their wartime experience, not because of its grandeur, but because of its simplicity. He told them they had won. The weight of what Cunningham carried through the Mediterranean campaign, the constant operational pressure, the supply shortages, the losses, the unceasing demands of a fleet at war in a confined sea, was not something he wore publicly. He was not a man who invited sympathy or solicited understanding. But the golf course at Alexandria, the blacked-out departure from harbour, the carefully staged reconnaissance aircraft over the Italian fleet, these are the marks of a commander who understood that war is, at its deepest level, a contest of knowledge, and who had decided, very early and very firmly, to win that contest at every level available to him. The guns were the last argument. Everything else came first. Chapter 9. The World They Fought For. Context of the Mediterranean Campaign. To understand what was at stake at Cape Matapan, you have to understand what the Mediterranean meant in the spring of 1941, not as a body of water, not as a strategic concept, as a living, breathing artery of a war that was going badly for the people who had not yet surrendered. France had been defeated in the summer of 1940. The evacuation of Allied forces from Dunkirk had saved men but abandoned equipment on a scale the British Army was still struggling to replace. The Battle of Britain had been won, but it had been won at a cost, and the German Luftwaffe was still capable of inflicting serious damage on British infrastructure. In North Africa, Rommel's forces were pushing the British back toward Egypt. In the Balkans, German armour was crossing into Yugoslavia and turning toward Greece, where British and Commonwealth forces had recently arrived to support the Greek defence. In this context, the Mediterranean Sea was not a background feature. It was the central logistical reality of the entire southern theatre. Every reinforcement that reached the 8th Army in North Africa came through Suez or round Africa. Every supply convoy that kept Malta alive had to pass through waters dominated, at various points, by Italian and German air power. Every British movement toward Greece required the use of sea lanes that the Italian fleet was theoretically capable of cutting at any time. Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet existed, first and last, to keep those sea lanes open. If he failed in that task, the consequences would cascade through the entire Allied position in the region. Malta was the pivot of this calculation. The island, sitting almost precisely in the center of the Mediterranean, was geographically perfectly placed to threaten both Italian supply lines to North Africa and the sea lanes running east from Gibraltar. From Malta, submarines, torpedo aircraft, and surface ships could intercept the convoys that were feeding Rommel's army in the western desert. If Malta fell, and in the spring of 1941, it was coming under the heaviest air bombardment it had yet experienced. That capability would be lost. The entire Allied position in the eastern Mediterranean would shift fundamentally. Holding Malta required keeping it supplied, which required using sea lanes, which required the Mediterranean fleet to remain an effective fighting force. The Greek campaign added a further dimension of complexity. British forces had arrived in Greece in early March of 1941, part of a commitment to support the Greek defense against an anticipated German invasion. The decision to send those forces was controversial at the time and has remained controversial in historical assessment. It was made partly for military reasons and partly for the political purpose of demonstrating that Britain would stand by its allies even when the military odds were unfavourable. Whatever the reasoning, the consequences were immediate and concrete. The supply of those forces required regular convoy runs from Alexandria to Piraeus, through waters that the Italian fleet's presence made dangerous. Every day that the Regia Marina maintained its freedom of action in the eastern Mediterranean was a day of added risk to those convoys. It was against this background that Operation Gordo, the Italian naval sortie that became the Battle of Cape Matapan, was conceived. The German High Command had pressed for an Italian naval operation that would disrupt British supply lines to Greece. The Italians had acquiesced, partly under pressure and partly because their own admirals understood the strategic logic, even if they were dubious about the specific plan. The eastern Mediterranean, they argued, was a British home ground. Cunningham knew those waters as well as he knew the streets of his home port. Any Italian sortie into those waters would be operating at a tactical disadvantage, regardless of the relative strength of the fleets. The Germans, who were not at that point deeply familiar with naval warfare's particulars, did not fully appreciate this argument. The operation proceeded. The men who fought on both sides of Cape Matapan inhabited this strategic context in the way that soldiers and sailors always inhabit their strategic context, which is to say, they were mostly aware of only the immediate. A rating aboard HMS Valiant, working his station during the night action, was not thinking about Malta's supply lines or the Greek campaign's political dimensions. He was thinking about the battle in front of him, the noise, the heat of the guns, the specific and demanding business of his own job, in the middle of an action that was moving faster than any training exercise had prepared him for. The grand strategic picture was visible from London, from Rome, from the planning tables of Cairo and Athens and Berlin. At sea, on the night of the 28th of March, it had compressed itself into something much smaller and much more immediate. For the Italian sailors aboard the Zara and the Fiume, the Mediterranean they were fighting for was something quite specific, the sea that their country had faced for the entirety of its recorded history, the sea that Italian merchant ships crossed on every tide, the sea that Italian fishermen had worked for generations beyond counting. The Regia Marina's designation, Royal Navy, was not an idle title. It carried the weight of a genuine national maritime tradition, older and in some ways richer than the British tradition it was now contesting. The men who served in it were not abstractions. They were the sons of port cities and fishing towns, of naval families and merchant families, of a country that had always understood itself in relationship to the sea surrounding it. What the battle stripped away was not that tradition. What it stripped away was a particular Italian assumption about the Mediterranean's future, the idea, which had been a central part of Mussolini's rhetoric since the 1920s, that Italy was the natural heir to Roman dominance of the inland sea. Mare Nostrum, the ancient phrase, had been revived as a political slogan, a way of asserting that Italy had a special claim to the sea that bordered it, that the presence of the British fleet in the eastern Mediterranean was a temporary and illegitimate intrusion. Matapan did not end that claim in any formal sense. It simply demonstrated, with the specific finality that only military defeat can provide, that the claim was not going to be enforced. The Allied convoys that Iachino's fleet had been sent to intercept continued to run after the battle. In April of 1941, they carried the last reinforcements to Greece as the German army pressed south. In the weeks that followed, they carried the men off the beaches of Greece when the defense collapsed, and then carried the defenders of Crete as that island came under assault from the air. The sea did not become safer after Matapan. German air power would impose appalling costs on the Royal Navy during the Crete campaign, and Cunningham would lose ships that no victory at sea could replace. But the surface threat from the Regia Marina had been reduced in a way that mattered. The Italian fleet would not hunt convoys in the eastern Mediterranean for 2 months. Those were 2 months of open sea lanes, at a time when every day counted. The Mediterranean, in the spring of 1941, was a sea under maximum pressure from every direction simultaneously. Cunningham's victory at Cape Matapan did not resolve that pressure. Nothing so contained as a single battle could resolve pressure so broadly applied. What it did was demonstrate that the pressure could be resisted, that the sea could be contested, that the enemy could be found and defeated, that the chain of failures and retreats that had characterized so much of the first year of the war was not inevitable. In the calculus of a war that was still being decided, that demonstration had a value that exceeded the sum of the ships sunk and the sailors lost. Chapter 10. Radio Silence and Radar, the technology that decided the night. Modern warfare is, at its foundation, a competition between what you can see and what you can hide. Before radar, the sea at night was an almost perfectly level playing field. Both sides were equally blind, and the advantage went to whoever was luckiest, or most cautious, or most willing to accept the discomfort of moving through darkness toward a danger that could not be quantified. Radar tipped that playing field, permanently and irrevocably. It gave one side eyes that the other could not match. And at Cape Matapan, the side with radar met the side without it in precisely the conditions: a dark night, close range, complete surprise, where radar's advantage was at its most absolute. The British radar, fitted to the ships of the Mediterranean Fleet in early 1941, was not, by later wartime standards, sophisticated equipment. The Type 284 gunnery fire control radar and the Type 279 air and surface search radar were early generation systems, subject to interpretation errors, requiring trained operators who could read their screens correctly under pressure, and not capable of the fine discrimination that later sets would achieve. But in the specific context of the night action at Matapan, ships at sea in darkness, at ranges of a few thousand yards, these limitations were essentially irrelevant. A radar return that told you there was a large, stationary metal object 6 miles to port on a specific bearing, in darkness, was worth infinitely more than the complete absence of information that the Italian side possessed. The absence of radar on Italian warships in 1941 was not a secret that the Royal Navy had been hiding from them. It was a gap in Italian technological development that reflected a confluence of factors: the death of Marconi before his radio location research had been brought to operational readiness, the institutional focus on surface gunnery over electronic warfare, and a failure of intelligence assessment that had led Italian naval planners to underestimate the extent to which the British had developed and deployed the technology. There were Italian naval officers who understood that radar existed. There were a smaller number who understood that the British had it. There was virtually no one in the command structure who had properly reckoned with what radar meant for night operations, that it fundamentally eliminated the one equalizing condition, darkness, that a slower and less offensively minded fleet might otherwise have exploited. The role of radio signals in the battle's outcome is a separate but equally important thread. The Italian fleet's communications were both too frequent and too revealing. Ichino's ships exchanged radio messages throughout the operation, and these messages, intercepted, processed, and analyzed, contributed to the British picture of Italian intentions and movements. More critically, the Italian naval command in Rome had sent signals that, once decrypted at Bletchley Park, had provided the foundational intelligence on which the entire British operation was built. The Enigma machine, the device on which Italian naval operational security depended, had been compromised. Every coded message sent on that system was potentially readable by the enemy, with a delay measured in hours rather than days. The asymmetry extended to radio discipline. British ships operating under Cunningham's command maintained strict radio silence throughout the approach phase of the operation. The British battle fleet moved east toward its rendezvous position in complete electronic silence, relying on prearranged timing and positioning to bring the various elements of the force into coordination without transmitting signals that Italian intercept stations might pick up. Italian ships, by contrast, communicated more freely, partly because they were confident in their cipher security, and partly because the command structure, with the naval headquarters in Rome, involved in real-time tactical coordination, required regular communications to function. Every transmission was a potential vulnerability. There was also the human factor in radar operation that deserves recognition. The operators who manned the radar screens aboard British ships had been trained not just in the technical operation of the equipment, but in the judgment calls that raw radar data required. A return on a screen is not labeled. It does not announce itself as an enemy cruiser. It is a blip, an echo, a shape in electronic noise that requires interpretation. The training to make that interpretation correctly, quickly, and consistently under operational stress was not something that happened automatically. It was the product of exercises, of accumulated experience, of a culture of technical seriousness that the Royal Navy had invested in developing because it understood, earlier and more clearly than most navies, that radar was not a peripheral technology, but a central one. When the radar operator aboard HMS Orion reported the stationary contact that turned out to be the Polar, he was performing an action that looks simple in retrospect and was anything but in practice. He was operating under the psychological pressure of a fleet action that had already lasted most of a day. He was working in the cramped, dimly lit environment of a cruiser's operations room. The contact on his screen was ambiguous, a stationary return in waters where there should not have been one. He reported it accurately, with appropriate positioning information, and his report reached Cunningham with enough precision to allow the Admiral to redirect his forces toward the contact. That chain of events, the training, the discipline, the accurate report, the decision, was as decisive as anything that happened when the guns opened fire. The Vittorio Veneto's escape was, in this technological context, something of an accident of timing. By the time Cunningham's battleships had completed the destruction of the Zara division, the Italian flagship was far enough ahead to have opened a gap that radar-guided pursuit could not close before daylight, and Italian air power would make further engagement impossible. Cunningham acknowledged this directly, noting that the battleship's escape was the one unsatisfying element of an otherwise complete victory. The technology that had made the night's success possible had also, in the specific geometry of that night, been unable to extend the victory to its logical conclusion. After the battle, the intelligence and technological lessons were assessed at multiple levels by both sides. The British took from Matapan confirmation that radar-equipped night operations were a reliable tactical tool, that the investment in the technology and the training had produced a genuine and repeatable advantage. The Italians took from Matapan a determination to develop their own radar capability, a determination that did eventually produce results, though not in time to affect the balance of the Mediterranean campaign in its critical phase. Admiral Iachino's reference to backwardness of our night battle technology was the clearest diagnosis anyone in the Italian High Command made of what had actually decided the night action. Clearer, in its way, than most British analyses of the same engagement. The technology of the battle exists now in museums and in technical histories. The radar sets that saw the Polar drifting in the dark are long gone. The ships that carried them are gone. But the principle they demonstrated, that knowledge of the battlefield, is itself a weapon, and that the side which can see what the other cannot will, in time, prevail, did not go away with the ships. It has been the central lesson of every significant naval engagement since, and it was never demonstrated more cleanly than on the night of the 28th of March 1941, 6 miles off the southern coast of Greece. Chapter 11. The Human Cost. Names behind the numbers. History has a way of converting human beings into numbers. It is not a malicious habit. The scale of the Second World War demands a language of statistics simply to comprehend it. More than 2,000 Italian sailors died or went missing in the waters off Cape Matapan. The phrase sits in sentences so smoothly that it is possible to read it without pausing, without imagining what it actually describes. The specific reality of more than 2,000 individual men who had been alive in the morning of the 28th of March 1941, and who were not alive by the time the sun came up the following day. The heavy cruiser Zara had a complement of approximately 840 men. She was one of the most modern heavy cruisers the Regia Marina had put to sea, completed in 1931, armed with 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, capable of 32 knots. Her captain in March of 1941 was Luigi Corsi. When the British battleships opened fire on her in the darkness, the ship that Corsi commanded, the machinery, the armor, the gun turrets, the compartments where men had eaten and slept and worked, was transformed in a matter of minutes into a burning, sinking wreck. Of the Zara's complement of roughly 840 men, the largest number did not survive the night. Those who made it into the water faced a dark sea and a cold night, and not all of them were still alive when daylight came and the destroyers began their rescue work. The Fiume's story was similar. She too was a Zara-class heavy cruiser, her captain Umberto Giartosio, her crew of similar size to her sister ship. She absorbed the first salvos from the British battleships with the directness of a ship that had no warning and no preparation, no alert, no battle stations, no time to bring weapons to bear in any effective response. The turrets that were not already aimed and loaded did not have time to become so. The distinction between those men aboard who survived and those who did not was, in the dreadful mathematics of that night, largely a matter of where on the ship each man happened to be standing when the shells arrived. The Polar's experience was different in its texture, if not ultimately in its outcome. The cruiser's crew had been powerless for hours before the British ships found them, unable to move, unable to communicate effectively, aware that the battle they could hear in the darkness was determining their future, unable to affect it in any way. The psychological burden of that powerlessness, the waiting, the uncertainty, the slow understanding that no rescue was coming from the Italian side, was a particular kind of ordeal that the men who survived and were later repatriated described in terms that have a quality quite different from the accounts of those caught in the sudden violence of the main action. They had time to think. That was, in some ways, its own form of suffering. The British losses were, in purely numerical terms, extraordinarily light. 3 men, Lieutenant Commander John Dalyell Stead, and the 2 members of his crew, whose torpedo aircraft was shot down by the Vittorio Veneto's anti-aircraft fire immediately after achieving the hit that damaged the Italian battleship. Their sacrifice was, in the military sense, precisely proportional to its effect. Their torpedo stopped the most powerful ship in the Italian fleet, initiated the chain of events that led to the night action, and was the single most consequential individual act of the entire battle. The 3 men who made it possible were killed by the ship they had just crippled, within moments of releasing their weapon. The Admiralty acknowledged their contribution in its official assessment of the battle. Dalyell Stead's Distinguished Service Order was gazetted posthumously. The 915 Italian survivors rescued by British destroyers before the German air attack forced the fleet to withdraw, represented, in the context of a battle that had killed more than 2,000 men, a significant and deliberate effort. The rescue was not conducted because it was tactically convenient. It was conducted because Cunningham and the officers commanding his destroyers believed that a naval tradition older than any single war required it. British destroyers had, for an hour and more, been pulling Italian sailors from water that was cold enough to kill. The men doing the pulling were sailors who had been in a surface action for most of the night. They were exhausted. They were working in darkness, with wreckage and oil around them. They did it anyway, because it was what sailors do for other sailors. The medical arrangements for the recovered Italian survivors were, by the accounts of those involved, generally adequate within the constraints of wartime shipboard medicine. Hypothermia was the principal immediate threat. Men who had been in the water for several hours in the March Mediterranean were in serious physical difficulty by the time they were pulled aboard. British naval medical staff treated Italian wounded alongside the limited number of British casualties from the air attacks earlier in the day. Language was a barrier, but in the circumstances of medical emergency, it appears to have been less of one than might be expected. Italian sailors who later gave accounts of their treatment aboard British ships described it in terms that, while not effusive, acknowledged that they had been treated with a professional decency that the circumstances of war could not automatically guarantee. The signal that Cunningham broadcast on the Merchant Marine emergency band, giving the location of surviving Italian sailors and offering safe passage to the hospital ship Gradisca, was, in one reading, a purely humanitarian act, and, in another, a gesture of professional respect from one naval officer toward the sailors of an enemy fleet. These readings are not mutually exclusive. Cunningham was not, by temperament, given to sentimentality. His rebuke from Churchill for transmitting the signal, the argument being that operational security concerns outweighed the humanitarian considerations, suggests that the decision was not an automatic one. He made a choice. The Gradisca reached the area and recovered several hundred more survivors. The men who died at Matapan left families in port cities along the Italian coastline who received their notifications in the weeks after the battle. The letters that followed, the official regrets, the slow absorption of loss into the ordinary life of families who had known the sea and its costs for generations. These happened far from the strategic assessments and the intelligence analyses and the victory celebrations in Alexandria and London. They happened in exactly the places where war always happens most profoundly. In houses, around tables, in the particular silence that follows the reading of a letter from the Navy. History compresses these moments into numbers. The numbers were real. Behind each of them was a person, a sailor, a son, a husband, a father, who had woken up on the morning of the 27th of March, 1941, and gone about the business of his day, without knowing it would be among his last. The British sailors who survived the battle, and most of them did, returned to service in a Mediterranean campaign that would continue for years, and that would demand more of them before it was finished. The Crete campaign 2 months later would cost the Royal Navy heavily, carriers damaged, cruisers and destroyers sunk, lives lost in numbers that made the victory at Matapan look like an island of light in a darkening sea. But the men who had been at Matapan carried it with them. Not as glory, which is a word sailors use less readily than civilians, but as a specific experience of having done the thing that training and preparation are for, under conditions that left no room for anything but performance. Chapter 12, Aftermath. What Matapan changed, and what it did not. The first morning after the battle was a morning of oil and silence. The destroyers that had done the rescue work moved through water thick with the evidence of the previous night's action. The Mediterranean, which had been the setting for one of the most decisive naval engagements of the war so far, resumed its ordinary appearance, blue, deceptively calm, indifferent to what had happened on and under its surface. The Italian fleet, what was left of it, was on its way home to ports where damage assessment teams were already preparing to receive the Vittorio Veneto's wounded hull. The British fleet was moving east toward Alexandria, carrying prisoners, wounded, and the quiet satisfaction of a force that had done what it set out to do. Cunningham's official report reached London within days, and the reaction there reflected the degree to which the Mediterranean war had been going badly enough to make a decisive victory feel like a change in the weather. The Admiralty's assessment was measured, but genuinely positive. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean had not been resolved, and no one in London was pretending otherwise. The German army was still moving through Greece. Malta was still under bombardment. The supply lines were still contested, but a significant Italian naval force had been destroyed. The Vittorio Veneto would be in dock for months, and the Italian High Command's already limited appetite for offensive naval operations in the eastern Mediterranean had been reduced further. These were real gains, even if they were not war-winning. In Rome, the reaction was managed with the particular care that the fascist state applied to any news that complicated the official narrative. Mussolini's government had spent years building a mythology of Italian naval power as an extension of Italian national greatness. The fleet was the embodiment of the empire's maritime destiny, the modern heir of Rome's ancient dominion over the sea. The loss of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, with more than 2,000 dead and the Vittorio Veneto in dry dock, was news that required very careful presentation. The Italian press gave the battle limited coverage. What coverage it received emphasized the heroism of Italian sailors and avoided the word defeat with a determination that was itself a kind of commentary on the scale of the loss. Within the Regia Marina, the reaction was more honest. Admiral Iachino prepared his after-action report with the thoroughness of a professional officer who understood that identifying what went wrong was the only way to prevent it from going wrong again. He had been at sea with a fleet built on assumptions that the battle had disproved. The German intelligence on British strength had been wrong. The promised air cover had not arrived. the coordination between the fleet and the shore-based air force had been as dysfunctional in practice as it had always been in theory. The night-fighting technology gap had been decisive. These were not excuses, they were diagnoses, and the distinction mattered. Iachino wrote them down with the intention that someone would read them and act on them. Some of them were eventually acted on. The Italians did develop radar technology as the war progressed, and by its later stages, Italian ships were equipped with systems that provided at least some of the capability that had been so fatally absent at Matapan. The coordination between the Navy and the Air Force remained problematic. It was a structural problem rooted in institutional politics that proved resistant to the kind of direct pressure that military failure can sometimes apply to technical problems. The Germans, who had their own reasons for wanting Italian naval performance to improve, pushed repeatedly for better air-naval integration and achieved partial results. But the fundamental architecture of the Italian military, Mussolini at the top, the individual services competing for resources and authority beneath him, was not a structure that responded quickly or efficiently to the lessons of tactical defeat. For the Royal Navy, the battle's afterlife was also complicated. The immediate operational benefit, the 2 months of reduced Italian pressure in the eastern Mediterranean, was real but finite. The Crete campaign, which began in late May of 1941, would cost Cunningham's fleet grievously. German air power, concentrated and expertly deployed, sank 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers during the evacuation of Crete and damaged the carrier Formidable, the same ship whose aircraft had been so decisive at Matapan. Cunningham, who had resisted the demand that the fleet withdraw from the risk of German air attack, suffered these losses with the same stoic professionalism with which he had accepted everything else. His fleet stayed in the fight. It paid for staying. The longer strategic consequence of Cape Matapan played out over the following 2 years. The Regia Marina never again mounted a significant offensive operation in the eastern Mediterranean. The fleet operated, increasingly, in defensive postures, protecting convoys to North Africa, responding to British threats rather than generating Italian ones. The psychology of Matapan, the knowledge that the British had radar, that British intelligence had penetrated Italian cipher systems, that a British battle fleet could find you in the dark and destroy you before you knew it was there, was not something that even the most aggressive Italian admiral could simply set aside. The fleet in being had become, more thoroughly than its doctrine had ever intended, a fleet that existed primarily by not fighting. For the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Cape Matapan represented something beyond a single operational success. It was the first major validation at sea, the first clear demonstration that the investment in ultra-intelligence was producing results that could be measured in ships sunk and battles won. The cryptanalysts who had broken the Italian naval enigma, who had processed and translated and distributed the intelligence that shaped Cunningham's operation, had done their work in the abstract, without direct connection to the physical events it shaped. Matapan gave that work a concrete outcome. It also demonstrated the intelligence principle that would govern ultra operations for the rest of the war, that the secret had to be protected at all costs, that using the intelligence meant covering it, and that the relationship between what you know and what you can be seen to know was as important as the knowledge itself. Prince Philip, who had been on HMS Valiant operating the searchlights that illuminated the Italian cruisers on the night of the 28th, was mentioned in dispatches for his performance during the battle. He was 19 years old. He would go on to serve throughout the Mediterranean and Pacific campaigns, and the experience of Cape Matapan, the specific visceral reality of a night action at point-blank range, the sudden flooding of black water with the white light of searchlights, the sight of what 15-inch guns could do at 3,800 yards, stayed with him as a formative experience of a war that shaped an entire generation. He spoke about it, occasionally, in the decades that followed, with the particular brevity that men who have been in battle sometimes use when discussing what they saw. The waters where the cruisers went down are, today, simply sea. There is no marker visible from the surface, no monument accessible to ordinary visitors, nothing to suggest that the Mediterranean off Cape Matapan is different from any other stretch of blue water, except that it is, in certain coordinates, considerably deeper than it looks. The Zara and the Fiume and the Pola are down there somewhere, 3,000 meters of water between them and the light. The destroyers are there too, And somewhere in that darkness, scattered now by 6 decades of current and pressure and the patient democratic processes of the deep sea, are whatever remains of the more than 2,000 men who went down with or around them. What Matapan changed was the balance of a war, not decisively, not permanently, not in a way that made the subsequent suffering unnecessary. Wars are not decided by single battles, and anyone who has studied the Mediterranean campaign knows how much suffering came after Matapan, the fall of Greece, the disaster at Crete, the long grinding contest of the North African campaigns, the losses at sea that accumulated through 1941 and 1942 before the tide turned. What Matapan changed was something more specific and more important: the terms on which the sea could be contested. The Italian surface fleet, after Matapan, was never again the offensive threat it had been. The eastern Mediterranean remained open, contested, dangerous, never safe, but open. The convoys ran, the war continued. And somewhere in a house in Buckinghamshire, a 21-year-old woman named Mavis Beatty went back to her desk and started looking at the next set of encrypted messages. Chapter 13, The Intelligence War, Bletchley Park, and the Silent Battlefield. Every war is fought on at least 2 levels simultaneously. There is the war that appears in photographs. Ships, guns, men in uniform moving through terrain that has been altered by the passage of armies. And there is the war underneath that war, the one conducted in silence, in rooms that look nothing like battlefields, by people who carry no weapons and wear no rank that the public would recognize. The second war shapes the first, invisibly and profoundly, and the further history moves from the events in question, the clearer the relationship between them becomes. At Cape Matapan, the silent war was every bit as decisive as the one fought with 15-inch guns, and the people who fought it have taken considerably longer to receive proper recognition. Bletchley Park in the spring of 1941 was simultaneously one of the most important and most deliberately obscure institutions in Britain. The country house itself, Victorian, rambling, slightly eccentric in its architecture, had been acquired by the government code and cipher school before the war as a facility that was large enough and sufficiently distant from London to house an expanding cryptanalytic operation without drawing attention. By early 1941, several thousand people were working there, organized into huts, the famous numbered wooden structures, each focused on a specific cipher system or intelligence product. The secrecy was absolute. The work was, for most of those doing it, profoundly isolated. You worked on your piece of the puzzle without knowing what most of the other pieces looked like. Dilly Knox's section, where Mavis Beatty and her colleagues worked on Italian naval enigma, was one of the more unusual corners of an institution that was not short of unusual corners. Knox himself was a figure of formidable intellectual reputation, a classical scholar who had broken codes in the First World War and who approached the problems of the Second with the same combination of classical training and lateral thinking. He was also, by most accounts, an extremely difficult man to work for in the conventional sense. Disorganized in his habits, intensely focused on problems that interested him to the near exclusion of everything else, and possessed of a teaching style that consisted largely of posing questions and waiting, with variable patience, for the people he had asked to find their own way to the answers. His team of largely young women, described by the historian of Bletchley Park as Dilly's girls, a phrase that Knox apparently used without condescension, produced some of the most operationally significant cryptanalysis of the entire war. The Italian naval enigma presented specific challenges that distinguished it from the German military enigma variants that other sections at Bletchley were working on. The Italian Navy had modified their enigma machines in ways that initially defeated the approaches that worked on German traffic, and the relatively lower volume of Italian naval signal traffic, compared to the massive output of German military communications, meant that the statistical methods that underpinned much of the German enigma work could not always be straightforwardly applied. The breakthrough that Beatty achieved in mid-March of 1941 was, in cryptanalytic terms, a genuine tour de force. She found a path through a cipher that had resisted the section's best efforts for months, using a combination of technical insight and the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that good codebreakers appear to develop through a combination of talent and accumulated exposure to encrypted material. The fragment that started everything, today's the day -3, was, in isolation, almost useless. Its value lay not in what it said, but in what it proved, that the key was readable, that the cipher was open, that the traffic flowing through this system could be understood. 3 days later, when the second message arrived and Beatty broke it to find operational orders for an Italian fleet sortie, the transformation from cryptanalytic success to strategic intelligence was essentially instantaneous. The message described the operation with enough specificity, forces involved, general direction, purpose, that the Director of Naval Intelligence could put it in front of Cunningham with confidence. The Admiral had his intelligence. The question was what to do with it. The cover story, the Sunderland flying boat that was directed to overfly the Italian fleet's area of operation, was a standard piece of ultra-tradecraft, the kind of operational cover that had been developed through trial and error in the months since Enigma decryption had become a reliable intelligence source. The principle was straightforward. Never act on ultra-intelligence without providing a plausible alternative explanation for how the intelligence was obtained. The flying boat gave the Italians a British reconnaissance aircraft to explain why the Royal Navy seemed to know where they were. It also, incidentally, actually spotted the Italian fleet, producing a genuine sighting report that could be cited openly without reference to signals intelligence. The cover was real, which made it perfect. After the battle, the management of the ultra-secret in relation to Matapan became an exercise in careful retrospective intelligence hygiene. The Italian Navy would, in the aftermath of their defeat, naturally ask themselves whether their communications had been compromised. The fact that a British reconnaissance aircraft had been directed to overfly their fleet gave them an answer that was true in its way, but incomplete in the most important particular. The Italians concluded that the British had known their general area of operations through conventional air reconnaissance, but had not broken their codes. This conclusion allowed the Italian naval Enigma system to continue operating without the kind of fundamental overhaul that a confirmed cipher compromise would have required. Bletchley Park's window into Italian naval communications remained open. Mavis Beatty lived until 2013, long enough to see the work of Bletchley Park fully acknowledged and her own contribution specifically recognized. In the decades before the ultra-secret was declassified, in 1974, she, like all the other Bletchley veterans, had maintained her silence about what she had done, as her wartime oath required. When the declassification came and the story could at last be told, her description of breaking the Italian Enigma and learning of the battle that followed was one of the clearest personal accounts of what it felt like to do intelligence work during the Second World War. The abstract concentration of the cryptanalytic problem, the specific shock of understanding what your abstraction had just made possible in the physical world, the complicated emotional territory of knowing that your work had contributed to the deaths of more than 2,000 people and the survival of how many more. She held all of this clearly, without false simplicity, as an honest account of what the work actually was. The relationship between the codebreakers and the commanders they served was, during the war, deliberately distant. Ultra-intelligence reached commanders through established channels, stripped of its technical origins, presented as fact without source. The people who produced it rarely knew the people who used it. Cunningham's visit to Bletchley after Matapan was exceptional, precisely because this distance was normally maintained. His decision to go in person, to acknowledge the contribution directly, was the kind of human gesture that institutions rarely make, and individuals sometimes can. The women of Dilly Knox's section, who had been forbidden by the most solemn oaths from telling anyone what they were doing, or what it had accomplished, received from a visiting admiral the confirmation that it had mattered, that it had worked, that the ships they had helped to position in the dark Mediterranean water had done what they were supposed to do. Intelligence history tends to be written from documents, signals, reports, assessments, and documents are, by their nature, formal and impersonal. The human experience of intelligence work, particularly the experience of the people at the working level rather than the command level, is harder to recover and harder to write. But at Matapan, the chain from the young woman reading encrypted fragments in a cold wooden hut to the Italian cruiser turning upside down under the British guns was short enough and direct enough that the connection becomes almost tangible. Beatty broke a code. A fleet sailed with knowledge it would not otherwise have had. 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. The chain is real. each link in it was a human being, working at the limit of what they knew how to do, in conditions they had not been trained for, because no one had anticipated needing to train for them. This is what the intelligence war looked like from inside it. Underscore. Chapter 14. Iachino's Burden. Command in Defeat. There are defeats that illuminate the people they happen to. They strip away the convenient draperies of rank and position and institutional affiliation and leave something more fundamental, the specific character of a specific person, dealing with a specific catastrophe in the specific way that only they could deal with it. Angelo Iachino's experience after Cape Matapan was this kind of defeat. He was 52 years old, a professional naval officer of 35 years standing, and he had just lost 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, while the flagship he was standing on limped home with a torpedo hole below her waterline. What he did with that experience, in the months and years that followed, says more about him than his service record does. Iachino was born in San Remo in 1889, the son of a family with no particular naval tradition. He had entered the Naval Academy at La Spezia in the early years of the century and had made his career through ability and consistent professional performance, rather than through patronage or family connection. By 1941, he had commanded destroyers, cruisers, and squadron formations, and had earned a reputation as a careful, methodical officer, exactly the kind of commander that an institution values for the reliability of his judgment and distrusts for the conservatism of his instincts. He was not a risk-taker. He was not, in the manner of Cunningham or some of the more aggressive British destroyer commanders, a man whose first instinct was toward the offensive option. The command dynamics of the Matapan operation had placed him in an almost impossible position. He had been ordered to conduct an offensive operation in waters that his own professional judgment told him were dangerous for the reasons his after-action report would later articulate precisely. He had accepted the operation because the political pressure from the German alliance made refusal effectively impossible. He had sailed with intelligence about British dispositions that he had no reason to distrust, and which was wrong in precisely the ways that made his tactical situation worst. He had made the decision to turn back when he smelled a trap, a correct decision, as it turned out, that saved the Vittorio Veneto from the gun duel that Cunningham had been maneuvering toward. And then he had made the decision to send the Zara and Fiume back to assist the Pola, a decision shaped by the naval tradition that you do not abandon a crippled ship, which sealed the fate of 2,000 men. The decision to send the Zara division back has been debated by naval historians for 8 decades. The argument against it is straightforward. Iachino had incomplete intelligence about British dispositions, and in conditions of uncertainty, sending heavy ships back toward a potential threat was an unacceptable risk. The argument for it is equally straightforward. The Pola was a heavy cruiser, a major national asset, carrying 800 men, and the naval tradition of assistance to a stricken vessel was not merely sentimental, it was fundamental to the operational philosophy of a blue water navy. Iachino made the humane, traditional, professionally correct decision in a situation where the specific facts made it catastrophically wrong. This is one of war's recurring ironies, that the right thing, done by the right person, for the right reasons, in the wrong circumstances, produces the worst outcome. His after-action report, submitted in the weeks following the battle, was a document of exceptional professional honesty. He did not attribute the defeat to bad luck or to the superior firepower of the enemy, though both were relevant. He identified, with specific and documented evidence, the 3 structural failures that had made the operation unwinnable. The German intelligence assessment of British strength that had been comprehensively wrong, the absence of air cover that had been promised and not provided, and the technological gap in night fighting capability that had allowed 3 British battleships to maneuver to point-blank range without being detected. Each of these was a failure of the system in which Iachino operated, not a failure of his individual performance. He said so clearly and attributed responsibility accurately, in writing, to an institution that was not accustomed to receiving such direct professional criticism from one of its senior commanders. Supermarina, the Italian Naval High Command in Rome, received Iachino's report with the combination of institutional defensiveness and genuine concern that characterizes most military establishments confronted with documented evidence of systemic failure. The more politically sensitive conclusions, particularly those relating to the failure of Air Force coordination, required careful handling in an institutional environment where the Navy and the Air Force were separate ministries with separate ministerial patrons and separate stakes in the outcome of any assessment. The reforms that Iachino's report implicitly demanded were partially implemented and partially resisted, with the predictable result that the next phase of the Mediterranean War found the Regia Marina somewhat improved in some areas and still critically weak in others. Iachino continued in command after Matapan. He was not removed because the Italian High Command correctly understood that the failures he had identified were structural rather than personal, and because replacing him would have required either acknowledging those structural failures publicly or constructing a scapegoat narrative that the documentary record would not support. He commanded Italian naval forces in subsequent operations, including the difficult convoy escort missions to North Africa, and acquitted himself with the same professional care that had characterized his entire career. The shadow of Matapan stayed with him, not, by his own account, as a source of personal shame, but as a perpetual reminder of what happened when the machinery of military organization sent men to sea without the tools they needed. He survived the war. In the years that followed, he wrote extensively about the Mediterranean campaign, producing accounts that were notable for their directness and their willingness to place the Italian naval experience in a broader analytical context. His memoir, published in the 1950s, remains one of the more useful Italian-language sources on the Mediterranean War, precisely because it does not engage in the retrospective mythologizing that some participants' accounts fall into. He described what happened, why it happened, and what it meant, with the economy of a professional who has moved past the need for self-justification. He died in 1976, having outlived most of the men he commanded at Matapan by 3 decades. What Iachino represents, in the longer history of the battle, is the part of defeat that does not fit neatly into either the heroic or the cautionary narrative. He was not a bad commander. He was not a coward. He was not a man who failed through incompetence or who sacrificed his men through recklessness. He was a careful professional who was handed an operation built on faulty intelligence, conducted without promised support, in conditions his fleet was not equipped to handle, by an institutional structure that had been telling him for years that these problems would be fixed and had not fixed them. He carried the weight of what happened off Cape Matapan with the thoroughness and the honesty of a man who understood that carrying it was part of the job. The broader question his career raises, how good commanders navigate bad systems, has no satisfying answer. Systems are what they are, and the individual who operates within them has limited capacity to overcome their structural failures through personal virtue or professional skill. Iachino operated his fleet as well as the fleet could be operated, given what it had. What it had was not enough. That verdict is not a condemnation. It is an honest accounting of the relationship between an individual and the institution that shaped him, sent him, and could not equip him for the particular night he sailed into. Chapter 15. The Mediterranean after Matapan, a sea in transition. The Mediterranean in the 2 months following Cape Matapan was a sea in the process of changing hands, and not in the direction that the battle's outcome might have suggested. The victory at Matapan had reduced the Italian surface threat in the eastern Mediterranean to near irrelevance for the short term. But the Mediterranean War was not fought by surface ships alone, and the absence of the Regia Marina's cruisers from the eastern sea lanes did not make those lanes safe. It made them available for a different kind of danger that was, in many ways, more difficult to counter than anything the Italian surface fleet could provide. German air power arrived in the Mediterranean theatre in January of 1941, when the Fliegerkorps 10, the specialist anti-shipping air unit that had operated in Norway, was transferred to bases in Sicily to address the failures of Italian air forces in the region. Within a week of their arrival, they had demonstrated their capability by attacking the carrier HMS Illustrious with a precision that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Illustrious survived, barely, and had to be withdrawn to the United States for repairs that kept her out of the war for over a year. The message was clear. German dive-bombing accuracy, particularly against ships at sea, was in a different category from what British forces had faced from Italian aircraft. The Mediterranean was about to become a much more dangerous place for surface ships. The Crete campaign, which began in late May of 1941 with the German airborne assault on the island, placed Cunningham's fleet in an almost untenable position. The Navy was expected to support the defense of Crete and then, when the defense failed, to evacuate the garrison. All of this within range of German air power that operated from airfields in Greece and the Dodecanese without effective British air opposition. The losses were severe: 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk, and additional ships damaged severely enough to require extended repair. The carrier Formidable, whose aircraft had been so decisive at Matapan, was hit and damaged by dive bombers in the waters south of Crete. Cunningham refused, despite pressure from his staff and from London, to withdraw the fleet entirely, maintaining that the Army's need for evacuation outweighed the fleet's survival. He was right. He also, to his credit and sorrow, knew exactly what his decision was costing. This is the period that the Battle of Cape Matapan tends to disappear into, in the broader narrative of the Mediterranean War. The battle was a British victory, clean and decisive. What followed it was not clean and not decisive. The historian who draws a straight line from Matapan to eventual Allied victory in the Mediterranean is eliding 2 years of grinding, costly, often desperate fighting that came between them. 2 years in which the question of who controlled the Mediterranean was genuinely open, in which Malta came closer to falling than most histories acknowledge, and in which the balance of the naval war shifted multiple times before it finally stabilized in favor of the Allies. Matapan mattered. It did not settle the matter. The supply war, the contest over the convoy routes from Italy to North Africa that sustained Rommel's army, continued through 1941 and into 1942 with an intensity that the surface battle at Matapan had barely touched. Italian and German convoys crossing the central Mediterranean were targeted by British submarines operating from Malta, by torpedo aircraft, and by surface forces whenever they could be positioned for interception. Italian warships, including those that had survived Matapan and those that subsequently replaced the lost ships, were heavily committed to convoy escort duty, a mission that was tactically unambitious but strategically vital, and that imposed a steady toll of loss from submarine attack and aerial interception. The Regia Marina, that had been an offensive threat before Matapan, became, after it, primarily a defensive asset, and defensive assets in the Mediterranean in 1941 were consumed at a rate that the Italian industrial base struggled to replenish. The British position in the Mediterranean reached its nadir in the summer and autumn of 1942. Malta's fuel and food stocks fell to levels that made continued resistance a matter of days rather than months. The convoy operation known as Pedestal, in August of 1942, ran 14 merchant ships through the western Mediterranean to Malta, under escort from the most powerful convoy protection force the Royal Navy had assembled, and still lost 9 of the 14, along with the carrier Eagle and other warships, to the combined efforts of Italian and German air, submarine, and surface forces. Only the survival of the tanker Ohio, barely afloat, with her deck nearly level with the water, lashed between 2 destroyers to keep her moving, saved Malta. The supply of aviation fuel that Ohio carried allowed the island's aircraft to keep flying. The island held. The relationship between Matapan and these later events is not one of direct causation, but of context and constraint. Matapan removed the Italian surface fleet as an offensive threat in the eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of the war's critical period. It did not remove the surface threat in the central Mediterranean, where Italian cruisers and destroyers continued to operate. It did not neutralize German air power, which was the dominant threat in the period from early 1941 to mid-1942. It did not solve Malta's supply problem, which was ultimately solved by the Pedestal operation and then permanently resolved by the Allied victory in North Africa in 1943. What it did was simplify the threat picture in one specific area, at one specific time, in a way that made the continued operation of British sea routes in the eastern Mediterranean somewhat less dangerous than it would otherwise have been. For the sailors who continued to serve in the Mediterranean after Matapan, the battle was a memory rather than a turning point, a moment when things had gone clearly and decisively right, in a campaign that had many more moments when things went clearly and decisively wrong. The men who had been on Warspite and Valiant and Barham during the night action, who had watched the Italian cruisers destroyed at point-blank range, went on to serve through operations that were far less satisfying in their outcome. Barham herself was sunk by a German submarine in November of 1941, with the loss of more than 800 men, a loss so serious and so demoralizing that the Admiralty suppressed news of it for weeks. The sea took back, with the patient indifference it brings to everything, some of what Matapan had given. The transition of the Mediterranean, from contested to Allied-controlled, was ultimately completed not by any single naval battle, but by the combination of the North African campaign's conclusion in May of 1943, the subsequent Allied landings in Sicily and Italy, and the armistice that brought Italy out of the war in September of 1943. When the Italian fleet surrendered, it sailed to Malta, the island it had been trying to neutralize for 3 years, and the ships anchored there under Allied supervision. Cunningham sent the signal to London that has become one of the most quoted messages of the entire naval war. Be pleased to inform their lordships that the Italian battle fleet now lies at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta. Cape Matapan was one of the first notes in the long cadence that ended with that sentence. Underscore. Chapter 16. The Ships, Birth, Service, and End. The heavy cruiser Zara was laid down at the Odero Terni Orlando shipyard at Trieste in July of 1928 and launched in April of 1930. She was the lead ship of her class. The Zaras were among the most admired heavy cruisers of their generation, built within the limits of the Washington Naval Treaty, but engineered to extract every possible advantage from those limits. Her main armament was 4 twin turrets carrying 8-inch guns. Her design speed was 32 knots. She displaced roughly 11,300 tons standard. Naval architects and observers from other navies who studied the Zara-class design generally concluded that the Italians had achieved something genuinely impressive, a cruiser that was well armed, well protected, and fast enough to be operationally useful across the full range of tasks a heavy cruiser might be expected to perform. The Fiume was the second ship of the class, built at the same Trieste yard and launched in April of 1930 as well. The Polar, the third of the 3 sisters lost at Matapan, was slightly different in construction detail, slightly heavier, and had been built at Livorno. Together, the 3 cruisers represented the Regia Marina's 1st Cruiser Division, the flagship formation of Italy's heavy cruiser force, intended as the premier offensive element of the Mediterranean fleet. They were assigned to the same squadron, trained together, operated together, and as it turned out, died together, within miles of each other, in the same engagement, over a span of a few hours. There is something in this collective history, 3 ships of the same class, from the same yards, assigned to the same division, sunk in the same battle, that feels like it ought to have significance beyond the merely logistical. Naval historians tend to assess ships as individual units, and the loss of any one of the 3 would have been significant in the context of Italian naval strength. The loss of all 3 simultaneously removed from Italian service an entire class of modern heavy cruisers in a single night. It was not just a tactical defeat. It was a structural one, a gap in the order of battle that Italian shipyards, already stretched by wartime demands, could not fill on any timescale relevant to the Mediterranean campaign. The Vittorio Veneto, which survived Matapan with her torpedo damage, had a wartime career that continued for 2 more years. She was repaired at Taranto over the following months, returned to service, and participated in subsequent operations, including the First Battle of Sirte in December of 1941 and the Second Battle of Sirte in March of 1942, before being torpedoed again, this time by the British submarine HMS Urge in January of 1942. She survived that attack too, and was under repair until September of 1943, when the Italian armistice brought her career as a warship to an end. She sailed to Malta as part of the surrendering Italian fleet, was interned at Augusta in Sicily, and was eventually scrapped in 1950. She never fired her guns in anger after the Second Battle of Sirte, the ship that had been the target of Cunningham's operation, the ship that had escaped when everything else was sinking, spent the last 2 years of the war in dry dock and surrender anchorage. HMS Warspite, Cunningham's flagship, and the ship from whose bridge the action was directed on the night of the 28th, had one of the most storied careers of any ship in the Royal Navy. She was already 25 years old at Matapan, a veteran of the First World War, who had been at Jutland in 1916 and had somehow accumulated a reputation that newer, more powerful ships could not match. She was damaged at Crete in May of 1941, repaired in the United States, and went on to serve in the Indian Ocean, in the bombardments supporting the Normandy landings in 1944, and in the operations off the Netherlands in the final year of the war. She was mined twice and bombed repeatedly, and survived everything that the Second World War could throw at her. She was finally sold for scrapping in 1947, but on the way to the breaker's yard, she broke her toe in a storm and ran aground in Prussia Cove on the Cornish coast. She had to be cut up where she lay. It was, in its way, an appropriate ending for a ship that had never done anything the easy way. HMS Barham, which had been part of the battle fleet at Matapan and had added the weight of her 15-inch guns to the destruction of the Italian cruisers, had already been mentioned as a ship whose end came not through the kind of dramatic night action that Matapan represented, but through a single, sudden, catastrophic event. In November of 1941, the German submarine U-331 found Barham operating without adequate anti-submarine protection in the eastern Mediterranean and fired a spread of torpedoes that struck the battleship on her port side. Within minutes, 4 of them, by careful reconstruction from witnesses' accounts, Barham rolled to port, her magazines exploded, and she disappeared. More than 860 of her crew went down with her. The explosion was filmed by a cameraman aboard a nearby vessel, and the footage, the great ship rolling, the sudden, terrible eruption, became one of the most widely seen pieces of combat footage of the entire war, although the Admiralty suppressed it for several months to prevent the demoralizing effect of its publication. The destroyers that had participated in the Matapan action had their own subsequent histories, most of them characterized by the continuous operational pressure of Mediterranean service. HMS Jervis, the destroyer that had finished the Zara and the Polar with her torpedoes, became one of the most decorated small ships in the Royal Navy's wartime history, surviving a remarkable series of actions and emerging from the war intact. HMS Havoc, which had found the Polar drifting and brought off her survivors, was less fortunate. She ran aground off the Tunisian coast in April of 1942 and was lost. HMS Nubian survived the war and was scrapped in 1949. HMS Greyhound, whose searchlights had illuminated the Italian cruisers on the night of the action, was sunk by German aircraft during the evacuation of Crete in May of 1941, within 2 months of her role at Matapan. HMS Perth, the Australian light cruiser that had been part of Pridham Whipple's force and had been at sea throughout the Matapan operation, had a fate that connected her story to the wider Pacific War that was still, in March of 1941, 8 months away. After service in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, Perth was transferred to the Pacific in late 1941. In the chaos of the Japanese offensive through the Dutch East Indies, she was sunk in the Sunda Strait in March of 1942, exactly 1 year after Cape Matapan, along with the American cruiser Houston, in a night action against a greatly superior Japanese force. Her captain at that action, Hector Waller, had also been in command of one of the destroyers at Matapan. The Mediterranean War and the Pacific War overlapped, in their personnel and their ships, in ways that the grand strategic narratives sometimes lose sight of. The physical artifacts of the battle, the pieces of the Zara and the Fiume that were taken aboard British ships before the cruisers were torpedoed, the Italian Breda machine guns lifted from the Polar before she was sunk, the documents and manuals and signal books retrieved by boarding parties, entered the system of Allied intelligence assessment and contributed, in ways that are difficult to precisely trace, to the broader understanding of Italian naval capability and equipment. The Breda guns were put into service by the Royal Navy as anti-aircraft weapons. The documents went to intelligence analysts. The ships themselves went to the bottom. The Mediterranean has a way of absorbing what the surface gives it, holding it in the darkness below, beyond the reach of curiosity or commemoration. Chapter 17. Legacy. What the battle meant then and now. A battle's legacy is not fixed at the moment the guns go silent. It changes as the people who survived it age and die, as the documents that were secret become accessible, as the historical context in which the events occurred is reassembled and reinterpreted by people who were not there. Cape Matapan has had several different legacies, running in parallel at different distances from the events of the 27th through 29th of March 1941, and they are not entirely consistent with each other. The immediate legacy, in 1941, was the one that military institutions care about most, the operational. 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers sunk. Italian battle fleet confined to Western Mediterranean operations for 2 months. Supply lines to Greece briefly less threatened than they had been. Bletchley Park's Italian Enigma operation validated. And, on the other side of the ledger, the escape of the Vittorio Veneto, which Cunningham considered the one unsatisfying element of an otherwise complete victory. In operational terms, Matapan accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. It was a successful execution of a complex, intelligence-driven, multi-element naval operation under conditions that tested every aspect of the fleet's capability and found it, on balance, adequate. The political legacy, in Italy and Britain, was shaped by the specific pressures of wartime information management. In Britain, Matapan was used, carefully, without compromising ultra, as evidence that the Mediterranean War was winnable, that the Royal Navy could take the fight to the enemy and come out decisively ahead. In Italy, it was managed rather than acknowledged, presented in terms that emphasized Italian heroism and minimized Italian defeat, and fairly quickly absorbed into the general category of setbacks that the war was producing in sufficient number that any individual item could be diluted into the broader narrative. The Italian sailors who died at Matapan received the formal honors that the fascist state gave to military dead, honors that were genuine in their acknowledgement of sacrifice, even when the institutional context that surrounded them was deeply compromised. The longer historical legacy, which became accessible only after the ultra-secret was declassified in 1974, involved a fundamental reassessment of the battle's causation. Before declassification, the standard account attributed the British victory primarily to superior tactics, better-trained crews, and the aggressive leadership of Cunningham. All true, but incomplete. After declassification, the role of signals intelligence moved to the center of the historical picture, and Mavis Beatty and her colleagues in Dilly Knox's section received a recognition that they had been unable to claim during the decades when their contribution was still classified. The battle became, in retrospect, one of the clearest examples of what intelligence advantage, real, specific, operationally applicable intelligence, could accomplish in a naval context. It became a case study. For the naval community specifically, Matapan became part of the canon of examples used in discussions of night fighting, radar integration, and intelligence-informed operations. The specific geometry of the night action, 3 battleships at point-blank range, 5 minutes to destruction, complete surprise achieved through a combination of radar and prior intelligence, was analyzed in naval staff colleges and operational planning documents for decades after the war. The lesson was not simply that radar was useful or that intelligence mattered. The lesson was that the combination of intelligence about enemy intentions with technology that extended tactical awareness beyond visual range, applied by a commander willing to act aggressively on the combination, could produce results disproportionate to the forces involved. This principle had applications far beyond the specific circumstances of Matapan. The human legacy of the battle, the families of the Italian dead, the survivors who were eventually repatriated, the British sailors who served on afterward, followed the slower rhythms of individual and family history rather than the faster rhythms of institutional assessment. Some of the Italian survivors eventually wrote or spoke about their experience: the hours aboard the powerless Polar, the night in the water, the strange combination of gratitude and grief that attended their rescue by the enemy. Some did not. The experience of being a prisoner of war in a country that had just killed your shipmates and your ship was not, for most people, something that lent itself to easy narrativization. Prince Philip's connection to the battle became one of the more publicly discussed aspects of his life, partly because of who he subsequently became, and partly because the Searchlight episode was specific enough and personal enough to make a good story. His own accounts of the action, given in the decades that followed, were consistent in their modesty. He had operated a searchlight. He had done what he was trained to do. The people who deserved credit for the battle's outcome were the commanders and the senior officers who had planned and executed it. This modesty was probably accurate in the sense that no individual act of a 19-year-old midshipman turned the battle's outcome. It was also probably genuine in the sense that someone who had been in a real action at close range had a basis for assessing the difference between his own contribution and the contributions of the people around him. The physical site of the battle, the waters off Cape Matapan, the southernmost point of the Greek mainland, is today a place of no particular memorial significance. There is no monument above the water. The cape itself is known primarily to sailors for its rocky character and the lighthouse that marks its headland. Divers have, over the years, explored the wrecks of the Italian cruisers in the depths below, but the depth and the conditions make access difficult, and the site has not been developed as a significant maritime heritage location in the way that some other major naval battle sites have been. The sea holds its history with less sentiment than the land does. The final legacy is perhaps the most diffuse and the most durable. Cape Matapan has all the elements that make for stories that last: a codebreaker in a cold hut, an admiral playing golf, biplanes against battleships, radar in the darkness, point-blank gunnery, a rescue in the dawn, the human cost of institutional failure, the strange mixture of professionalism and humanity that characterizes the best military conduct under the worst possible conditions. It is a story about knowledge and ignorance, about preparation and improvisation, about what happens when everything a system was built to prevent turns out to be exactly what the system was built on top of. These themes do not age. They are as readable in the 21st century as they were at the time, because they are not, at their deepest level, about the 1940s. They are about how human beings operate under extreme pressure, and that subject does not have an expiry date. Chapter 18. The Sea Remembers. Final Reflections. There is a particular quality to the ending of a war story. Not the ending of the war itself. Wars do not end cleanly, whatever the history books say, but the ending of the specific story, the individual arc that began with a purpose and found its resolution, or something close to it. The story of Cape Matapan has several endings, depending on whose timeline you follow. For Mavis Beatty, it ended on a morning when she heard that the intelligence she had recovered had won a battle. For Cunningham, it ended somewhat unsatisfyingly, with a battleship on the horizon that his destroyers couldn't catch. For Iachino, it ended at Taranto, with a damaged flagship and a report to write. For the men in the water, off the Greek headland, the endings were various and irreversible. But there is an ending to the story that belongs to the sea itself, and the sea's endings are neither satisfying nor unsatisfying. They are simply what they are. The Mediterranean absorbed the wreckage of the Zara and the Fiume and the Pola and the Alfieri and the Carducci with the same indifference it brings to everything that sinks into it. The oil dispersed. The debris sank or drifted. The men in the water, those who were not rescued, became part of the sea in the most literal way. The water closed over the battle site within days, and the surface of the Mediterranean, which is not given to holding the shapes of what happens on it, returned to its ordinary appearance: blue, old, continuously indifferent. The ordinariness of what the sea does to human events is not a melancholy observation, or at least it is not meant as one. It is a statement about scale, about the relationship between the brevity of a single battle, however decisive, and the long duration of the things that outlast it. The Mediterranean has been a contested sea for 3,000 years. It will continue to be contested in ways that do not involve the Regia Marina and the Royal Navy, for as long as it is bordered by states that have interests that overlap and conflict. The battles of the Second World War were specific to their time, their technology, their political circumstances. The sea they were fought over is not specific to anything. What endures from Cape Matapan is not the ships or the specific technologies or even the specific strategic outcome, all of which belong to their historical moment. What endures are the questions the battle raised, which are not historical questions at all. How does a system fail the people who serve in it? What is the cost of building for a war you intend to avoid, rather than a war you intend to fight? What does courage mean in a context where courage is not enough, where the bravest crew aboard the most capable ship still cannot compensate for the absence of radar, the failure of air cover, the penetration of the cipher system? What does integrity look like when a commander has to write an honest account of a catastrophe to an institution that produced the catastrophe? These are questions that Iachino answered, in his way, in his after-action reports and his subsequent writing. They are questions that Cunningham answered differently, through his actions during the operation and his behavior afterward, the golf course, the blacked-out departure, the radar-guided pursuit, the signal about survivors, the visit to Bletchley. They are questions that Mavis Beatty answered in the manner of someone who broke a code because she was trained to break codes and because the work needed to be done, and who then maintained silence about what she had done for 30 years because she had taken an oath. These answers are not universal lessons, applicable to every situation that resembles them, but they are honest answers, given under real conditions, by real people who did not have the luxury of getting them wrong without consequences. The sailors aboard the Zara and the Fiume and the Polar did not answer these questions, at least not in any documented way that history has preserved. They were sailors, not admirals or codebreakers. Most of them were young. The naval conscript of any nation tends to be young, and most of them had joined the Regia Marina without choosing it in any meaningful sense. They were the products of a system that was not of their making, serving on ships that were the products of decisions made before most of them were adults, carrying the institutional failures of a navy into a night that those failures had helped to create. They served their stations. They did what they were trained to do. And when the British searchlights came on, they had perhaps a moment, a fraction of a second, an eternity, in which they understood what was happening. Then the guns fired. The rescue by British destroyers, the signal that brought the hospital ship Gradisca, the medical care given to the survivors aboard British ships. These were acts that existed entirely outside the strategic and institutional context of the battle. They happened because the men doing them believed that certain obligations do not dissolve in wartime. This belief, that there is a flaw of human obligation that military conflict cannot breach, that the man in the water is a man in the water before he is an enemy, is not sentimental, it is practical. It is the belief that makes it possible for wars to end and for the people who survived them to live in the same world afterward. Cunningham understood this. The signal he sent was a professional act and a human one simultaneously. The men of both fleets who survived Cape Matapan lived long enough, most of them, to see the war end and the world change around it. The specific causes for which they had sailed, Italian Empire, British imperial control of the Mediterranean, the specific geopolitical arrangements of the early 1940s, did not survive in the forms that had seemed, in 1941, so fixed and so fundamental. Italy became a republic. Britain's Mediterranean position contracted as the empire it had been defending contracted. The ships rusted and were scrapped, or went to the bottom and were left. The sea remained. What remained most durably from Cape Matapan was not the outcome of a specific battle, but the evidence that human beings, placed in the worst conditions that the worst of centuries could devise, were capable of intelligence, professionalism, care for one another, and honest self-assessment. The codebreaker who broke the cipher, the admiral who played golf to protect a secret, the torpedo pilot who flew into point-blank anti-aircraft fire, the radar operator who reported his contact accurately, the destroyer sailor who pulled an enemy out of the water, the defeated admiral who wrote an honest report. These were not extraordinary people in the biographical sense. They were people who were asked to do specific things in specific moments and who found, to whatever extent was possible, the resources to do those things well. History is full of moments when it asks ordinary people for extraordinary performance. Cape Matapan is the record of one of those moments. The sea off the southern tip of Greece holds the rest.